So here we are in Chapter 4, and the topic of this chapter is biotransformation. And kind of put this in the context of where we've been. Right? Last lecture, we started to talk about the ADME of drugs under the umbrella of pharmacokinetics. And so sometime after our last lecture and before today, I put a homework lecture on the Blackboard page called the Kinetics Homework Lecture. And I know it's gotten a lot of activity lately, but I hope that you looked at it or will get that in somehow. Because some of these letters I talk to in more detail or expand on some stuff. But the ADME, the PK aspects of pharmacology, under the A, we talked about, drug getting into the systemic circulation and the systemic circulation as a conduit for the D, right, for the distribution. And so in A, we talked about bioavailability and why that's important. We talked about first pass effect. And the first pass effect, we didn't really look at it as a bad thing or a good thing, just as a phenomenon that occurs for some drugs. And then depending on the fraction of drug that gets through the liver to the systemic circulation, depending on whether or not that fraction is effective at treating the disease, right, maybe giving the drug orally is still okay if there's a big first pass effect, if what gets out is enough for effect, for efficacy. But if what gets out of that liver, this table being a representation of liver, if what gets out is that much, but you really need that much for efficacy, right, then that much isn't that much and you don't get efficacy, so you go to another route of administration. So we spend a lot of time on routes, right, so routes of administration. And we talked about advantages, disadvantages, and so on. Then under A, we talked about this idea of movement, right? Absorption, the drug moving across barriers. Right? And so the barriers were things like the intestinal epithelium, right? Movement across the intestinal epithelium into the blood. We talked about special barriers like the blood-brain barrier, right? And so when we talk about the movement across the barriers, we talked about flux. Flux is movement down a concentration gradient. And flux is described by Fick's law of diffusion, right? So we talked about Fick's law. And we talked about the fact that flux is directly proportional to things like surface area, right? To things like the actual concentration gradient difference between region A and region B. And then the third part of that Fick's law numerator, right, was something called the lipid aqueous partition coefficient. Lipid aqueous partition coefficient. And that tells you something about the tendency of the drug to dissolve in fat, to dissolve in water. Now, you may have learned about something called velocity. So these are all important to flux. And so then we get over to distribution, and that's the drug reaching the target site. And there we talked about the volume of distribution. And what volume of distribution meant was, if there's a high volume of distribution, it means the drug is able to leave the systemic and go into target tissue, right? It can move out of the blood into the tissue. While if there was a low volume of distribution, right, usually the drug would be kind of stuck in the watery component of the body, right? So we had talked about a drug, for example, that needs to cross into the brain, like an antidepressant drug or an anti-anxiety drug. Right, those drugs will tend to have high volume distribution. They've got to go through all that fat in the brain. Right, you have the neurons, like the glial cells, putting myelin around them, right? Those the astrocytes, other cells. So the drugs have able to get through all that stuff. Right? So usually those drugs have high volume distribution compared to a drug that might be positively charged and unable to move across barriers. So we talked about BP. We mentioned metabolism. We kind of went over it, and we talked last class about elimination. And we talked about elimination being the process of metabolism and excretion. And so our book gives us a whole chapter on the metabolism. That's coming today. And in terms of the excretion, we talked about removal of drugs from blood by tissues like liver or the kidney. Right? So here we had ports of exit being the liver and the kidney. There can be other ports of exit sometimes, certain drugs. You might be able to sweat the drug out. Right? Some of you know that you can sweat stuff out if you've got a grandparent or a parent who takes a garlic pill. Right? They smell like garlic, right? And sweat it out. So there are other ways of it to excrete, but the primary way is right, kidney. And so under there, we were talking about something called clearance. Right? Clearance was the amount of fluid cleared of drug per unit of time. Which fluid? Blood. Right? So units of clearance were milliliters per minute or liters per hour. Right? And so these two parameters came together when we talked about the drug half-life. Remember, half-life is directly proportional to the volume of distribution, inversely proportional to the clearance, and there's a constant in front of that, which is about 0.7. So the drug's half-life is directly proportional to its volume of distribution and inversely proportional to its clearance. And so in the homework lecture, I talked to you a little bit about factors that can affect volume of distribution. Right? So even if you look at a patient over their lifespan, right? Back when I was 12, I was mostly water and muscle lean. Right? Now I'm 42 and I'm kind of somewhere like 50. Muscle fat. Probably as I get older, if any of my older uncles are a predictor, I'll probably be mostly adipose by the time I get there. Right? So body composition can affect distribution. Right? There are certain things that can affect clearance, like disease states. Right? If most drugs are going to be excreted by the liver into the bile or by the kidney into the urine, and now you've got an injured liver. Right? Your liver's hurting. Right? It's not doing good. Excretion may be affected. Clearance may take longer to clear. Right? Look today. One of the greatest jazz blues guitarists of all time, B.B. King, in the hospital. He's really old, but other than being really old, he's got advanced diabetes. And I don't know why he's in the hospital, but I bet you it has something to do with his kidney. His kidneys are probably starting to fail. And let me tell you, what an artist. I mean, he didn't need any lights. He didn't need any blackout at the Super Bowl. He didn't need any reverb. Him and his guitar and band. Wow. I got to see him when I was a postdoc in the B.B. King Club in Times Square area. Awesome. So wish him well. Hope he pulls through. But clearance, therefore, is another important aspect here for half-life. Right? So we talked in the homework lecture how most drugs have half-lives. But then there are some drugs which really don't have a real half-life. Right? And those were drugs that experience something called zero-order kinetics. Right? So if you were to look at a plot of the rate of elimination of the drug versus concentration of the drug, right? Usually you see something like an S-shaped curve. And for most drugs, you never get to a high enough concentration where you're up here. Right? Most drugs are in the linear portion of the curve. Right? So the half-life doesn't change. Right? So for those drugs, we call them first-order kinetics. As opposed to drugs which actually do achieve high enough concentrations to saturate elimination. So in the homework lecture, I talked about something called flow-dependent elimination. As soon as the blood gets is there, it gets limited, dependent only on flow. So if you have congestive heart failure, the flow is altered. Clearance can change. Right? But then there was few drugs that exhibit capacity limited elimination. So no matter what concentration you give, you kind of saturated out the rate of elimination. Right? And so this was something like ethanol. This was something like phenytoin. All right, so getting back to our model here of half-life, here this is most drugs are under this kind of relationship, though not all. Right? And so the half-life is important now when we were talking in the homework lecture about target concentration for drugs. Remember, there's like a window around which you want to get your blood concentration because that can correlate with efficacy. Right? So if you look back to chapter 3 and you look at that table, it might, one of the columns in the table is bioavailability, one of the columns is line distribution, one of the columns is clearance. One of the columns is target concentration. What's the target concentration supposed to be? Right? And so it's different for every drug. Each drug will have its own target concentration. But usually it takes you about 4 half-lives of dosing to get into the therapeutic range. And here I'm talking about oral dosing. Right? And so the amount of drug that you lose from this point to this point, the amount of drug lost over that interval needs to be replaced in the next interval, or what happens? Or we will fall out of the therapeutic range. Right? So as soon as the body gets 4 half-lives worth of dosing, right, and it starts to eliminate the drug, if you didn't give another dose, the drug would keep going down and eventually it would stop working. But so you give back another dose, and then the body starts to eliminate. So you give back, and the body starts to eliminate. Give back. Right, that's going to be how much drug is lost over this interval. And so the dose that you give, right, so this is lost, and this is refill. Right? And we call that the maintenance dose. Maintenance dose. The dose needed to maintain the drug at steady state. And so this is an important concept, the steady state, because we're hugging the target concentration. Right? Obviously, if you do an IV infusion, you're in the middle of the valve. But here, I've lost some drugs, so take another dose to get it back. So this is an interval of time, and this is an amount of time. So that's what a maintenance is. So we talked about that in the homework lecture. We talked about something called a loading dose, where you can give an extra large first dose to just get you in the target concentration. Right? So maybe if you've ever seen the Z-Pack, right, the first dose you take 2 pills. And then all the rest of the doses, you take 1 pill. Well, that first dose gets you in there. So now in the subsequent doses, you're staying in that target. And so this is an important concept because we're going to talk about something called enzyme induction, enzyme inhibition. Where are we talking about this? In the liver. It's a pretty ugly liver. It looks more like I don't know. It looks like something, but I don't know what. But here's our liver. Right? And here's our enzyme. And let's say that the whole purpose of M, that its whole purpose is to take a drug that's well absorbed and convert it into a drug that's well excreted. Right? Because absorption is good for the drug getting in, but it's not good for the drug getting out. Right? So the whole purpose of M, of metabolism, is to take the drug that's well absorbed and make it well excreted. And in most instances, that's happening in the liver. And so the drug that's well absorbed comes in, and the drug that's well excreted comes out. I mean, it's not exactly that simple, and it's not 1-to-1 ratio, and I'm not trying to imply that it is. But the liver does biotransformation reactions to the drug to make it more excretable. And those biotransformation reactions are driven by hepatic enzymes. Right? So now let's imagine a situation where you inhibit those enzymes. What's going to happen to the levels of drug in the body? They're going to stay high. They're going to go low. This is still going to happen. Okay, what's going to happen if I inhibit those enzymes? It's going to stay high, right? And so the person's going to take another dose. Right? So you thought that they would have eliminated this much, but they only eliminated this much, they took another dose. And then we thought they would have eliminated that much, but they only eliminated less because of inhibition. They take another dose. And by the time you know it, you're into toxiclandia. Toxiclandia. Right? Do you see that? You inhibit the enzymes that break down and makes you get rid of the drug, then the drug keeps accumulating in the body. Right? And so toxiclandia is no good. On the other hand, let's say hepatic enzymes, instead of being inhibited, are induced. So now instead of having, what you normally have, you got like 3 times as much. Right? So the drug comes in, and does it stay in the body longer or shorter than otherwise would? Shorter. Right? So now in this person, you thought that, you would be able to get up to this target concentration. But what happens is, I gave the dose, but the body got rid of it to a degree more than I would have anticipated. So I gave another dose, and the body got rid of it. I gave another dose, and the body got rid of it. And I never really hit the target concentration. So, enzyme induction causes decreased efficacy. Enzyme inhibition causes toxiclandia. Or at least you like to avoid it. Causes toxiclandia, but has the potential to cause toxiclandia. Right? So let me give you an example of a classical enzyme inducer of hepatic reactions. A classic example is a drug called phenobarbital. So any of you who remember Jimi Hendrix, the great guitarist, so today we're on a guitar theme. Right? Jimi Hendrix left this world way too early because he mixed some phenobarb with some alcohol, right? And he had some serious problems there, right? So phenobarb is a sedative. It kind of makes you feel really mellow. People in the past used it as an anti-anxiety drug, but it has a low therapeutic index, and so benzodiazepines is kind of cornered the panic market, right? Usually you're going to take a benzo over a barb for anxiety these days. But phenobarbital is what we call a classical inducer. It was the first drug found to induce hepatic enzymes that are involved in these biotransformation reactions. When I say induce, I mean actually there are more enzymes than there otherwise would be. So here's Tom, and here's Jerry. Tom is not taking any phenobarb, and Jerry is taking phenobarb. Jerry's liver is chock full of enzymes. So along comes another drug Jerry needs to now take for his heart condition, and it's rapidly inactivated, never accumulated, has no effect. Now there are other things than just phenobarb, and I'll show you tables of this later, but this is the classical hepatic enzyme inducer. When I say classical, it's kind of like the classics, right? Like Mozart, Haydn, right? The other one, Beethoven. Those are the classics. Right? Those are like, music at its best, right? And so every student of pharmacology in every pharmacy school or in every health science program knows that phenobarb is a hepatic enzyme inducer. It's just one of those things. On the other hand, there are certain classical inhibitors of hepatic enzymes. The prototype being Tagamet, which is known by its generic name of cimetidine. Cimetidine. Cimetidine is a classic inhibitor of P450. And it's got a high incidence of drug-drug interactions associated with it. Because it blocks P450s, so those P450s get blocked, but another drug that would normally be metabolized by that P450 is now not being metabolized by that P450, so it's like shooting up and away. It's going well above therapeutic into toxic. Right, so cimetidine is a P450 inhibitor. It's available over the counter. People with acid reflux disease take it. You may have seen it in your pharmacy. And it's got a ton of drug-drug interactions associated with it because of its P450 hepatic enzyme inhibitory potential. Right, so here we've got the liver, and we're using it as the example, knowing that there are some exceptions to that. The skin has some metabolic power. The lung has some metabolic power. The kidney has some metabolic power. The liver, by far, is the most recognition of that. And those enzymes do these kinds of hepatic reactions. The first tends to be what we consider the rule. That these enzymes lead to inactivation of drug. So the drug gets changed through a hepatic reaction and it's no longer active. And that's sometimes referred to as detoxification. And that's usually probably what most of us think of when we think of biotransformation. That the change causes loss of activity. So imagine my fist being the drug, and now my thumb is sticking out. The hepatic reaction changed the drug like that. And that change resulted in loss of activity. The receptor no longer interact. It's going to go along and go into another reaction called the phase 2 reaction, and so on. That's usually what we think of. But there are other purposes for hepatic reactions that are useful things to know. The second is called the activation of prodrugs. A prodrug, by definition, is not a drug. It is a pharmacologically inactive substance. So you dispense a drug, and it's pharmacologically inactive until it's metabolized. So rather than being an inactivating event, metabolism causes an activating event. All right? So a good example of that, and there are many, would be the drug clopidogrel. It's also known as its trade name Plavix. Maybe you dispensed it in your pharmacy. Some of you saying yes, right? That's a drug that gets activated by metabolism. So it's neutral by itself, goes into your liver activates it, and now it becomes antiplatelet drug. Thirdly, in some situations, hepatic reactions cause the formation of partially active metabolites. And in some cases, those partially active metabolites are just as active as the parent compound. In other cases, they're less active. And so if we look at Valium, generic name diazepam, right? It's a benzodiazepine. I think of this one as a meteor shower, right? So you have the parent drug, and then all the metabolites are active too. Right? So metabolism didn't really inactivate anything. So not only was the parent active, so are its metabolites. So it's like its own amplifier. And I'm not saying that those metabolites don't eventually get conjugated and excreted, but they retain activity. So there'll be some weird examples we talk about this afternoon. Usually, though, it tends to be number one for most drugs. Just like most drugs tend to be, first order elimination kinetics and have half-lives and such. So, as I mentioned, lipophilicity tends to be an obstacle to drug excretion. And so usually we have to somehow change the drug to make it a little more excretable. Right? We need to go from drug being well absorbed, I don't know where I drew it anymore, drug being absorbed to drug being excreted. But sometimes a drug might not be changed at all. So renal excretion of unchanged drug contributes only slightly to elimination. But in some cases, some drugs are not changed at all. Right? So they're not metabolized at all. So I'll give you an example. There's a drug called metformin. Have any of you seen that drug before? Metformin is very useful in treatment of type 2 diabetes. But metformin is not metabolized. It doesn't go through phase 1, it doesn't go through phase 2. It comes in and it comes out looking the same. right? So what eliminates it is just it simply gets to the kidney and it gets filtered out. It dumped into the urine as is. There's no changes as needed. Is that what usually happens to drugs? No. What happens to that drug? There's another drug that I can think of right now that doesn't get changed, lithium. Lithium is a drug used to treat certain CNS things like bipolar disease. Lithium is just a salt. It's a little ion. Nothing happens to it. It doesn't get phase 1, doesn't get phase 2. It just moves with the water and eventually gets eliminated through the kidney. Now, if a person has kidney disease, these drugs can be a burden on their body because the body won't eliminate them as well, and they can still accumulate. So the things I've said over there are still apply. But these, two exceptions to the rule tell us that while most drugs have to be changed, not all drugs will be changed. And so here's the idea. The idea is to transform the drug. Transform the drug from one that's good for absorption to one that's going to be readily excreted. Let's see if I can turn on my pointer here. Is that one good? I don't know that one. Okay, good. Now, in some cases, this sometimes here is telling us that a phase 1 metabolite can retain activity. In some cases, the phase 1 metabolite can be toxic. Okay, so what drives this type of transformation are enzymes in the liver. And the enzymes in the liver can be kind of generally categorized as two major types. Those which mediate phase 1 metabolism versus those which mediate phase 2 metabolism. Now, if we were to kind of put all of these metabolic enzymes in a box, right, based on phase 1 or phase 2, phase 1 enzymes can be best described as mixed function oxidases. Mixed function oxidases. ACE means enzyme that cleaves oxygen. An oxidase cleaves oxygen. So what a mixed function oxidase does is it takes an O2 molecule and it breaks it into two O atoms. And one goes into the drug and one gets reduced into water. So a mixed function oxidase is involved in two things, in the formation of oxidized drug and in the formation of water. That's why it's called mixed function. It has two products. It's an oxidase enzyme that cleaves molecular oxygen. One atom goes into the drug, one atom goes into water. So most phase 1 hepatic enzymes are mixed function oxidases, and most of them belong to a family called the CYP450s, cytochrome P450s. So mixed function oxidase is a huge umbrella, and under that umbrella, taking up most of the room, are the cytochrome P450s. And in the cytochrome P450 family, there are many members, and they have kind of strange names. So let's kind of list them. We have member 1A2, 2B1, 2C9, 2C19, 2D6, 3A4, 3A5, and then down here at the bottom, probably obstructed view over here, 2E1. All right, and so these are members of the CYP450 family, and one of the common properties of these members is that they are MFOs. They take oxygen and split it into two pieces, one piece going into a drug to oxidize it, to make it more polar, the other oxygen going into water. And so the members of the cytochrome P450 family share that property. Right? So any member does this kind of oxidase action. But yet within the family, there are different members, right? Just like these days you have like the Kardashian family, right? And so you got like Khloe and Kylie and Courtney and Kim. You got Kim. And then you got, so you got members of the family, right? Bruce Jenner. And then down here in the P450 family, you have 2E1, which we call the toxic P450. And so I think there's a tie in the Kardashian family for that position. It's either Rob or it's Bruce. But one of them is the 2E1. And this is the toxic P450. It makes phase 1 metabolites that can be toxic. Right? And the property of its metabolites is they're highly reactive. They like to bind to things like DNA and RNA and protein. Now, the naming system is a little weird. So you see Arabic numeral, letter, and Arabic number. All right, so 1A2, 2B1, 2C9, 2C19. This is a naming system that was agreed upon years and years ago at a conference on drug metabolizing enzymes. All right. I could tell you more, but it would be a mess. Right. So let's just leave it at they have strange names. The P450 part of the name means that this is an enzyme that absorbs light if you were to put it in solution in a cuvette. At which wavelength? 450 nanometers. Right? So if you were to dissolve cytochrome P450-1A2 in solution, put it in a cuvette, put it in a spectrophotometer, its maximum absorption would happen at 450 nanometers. So when these were originally identified, they were said as being cytochromes that have a peak at 450 nanometers on the spectrographs that were coming off the machines. All right? And so cytochrome, the psi part, means that this is a metal-containing protein. It's a metal-containing protein, and in fact, the metal is housed within a cofactor called heme. So it's a heme-containing protein. Chrome means metal in Latin. Right? So chrome means metallic. So this is a protein that's got a metal within its structure, but the metal is really part of this heme cofactor that has a peak absorbance at 450 nanometers. Do you know another protein in the body that has a heme cofactor that you may have learned about in biochem? Hemoglobin, right? And do you remember what hemoglobin carries around the body? Well, it contains iron, but what is it? Oxygen, right? It binds up oxygen and then releases oxygen, right? So the heme part of the CYP450 will pick up oxygen. Right? So you're an oxidase. You're an enzyme that cleaves oxygen. Don't you need to have a hand on oxygen? Don't you need that in the active site? You need to grab it. So you grab it on the heme cofactor. Right? So all of these members of the family have a heme cofactor. Right? But they're different enough from each other that they're given different names. And different meaning on the amino acid level. The amino acid level.
So does that mean that
Well, no. All of the P450s basically take this oxygen, split it, and oxidize the drug and make water. They all do that. But where they're different is in their amino acid sequences.
They don't have an effect on the...
Nope. Do they all do the same thing? I mean, at the most basic level, they all do the same thing, right? So it's just like, you're all pharmacy students, right? Well, almost all, right? We have some other health science majors in the room, right? But basically, let's just say health science majors, right? We're all health science majors, right? So there's something common about us all. There's a curriculum we have to take, certain standards we have to meet, certain things we have to do to be considered students of health science. So there's certain things that these enzymes have to do that allow them to be categorized into this family. All right, so they all what? They all do this oxidase action. They all have a heme cofactor. They all absorb light at 450 with a peak there. So those are the common properties. But then, this one might look different than this one. Might be 20 amino acids longer, or this one might have several different amino acids in the active site than this one does, right? So yeah, you can if you just think of the active site of an enzyme, right? Let's call this the active site, right? This is where the substrate comes in, so we'll say the drug, right? So we got to be able to bind the drug, and since this is an oxidase, we got to have a molecule of oxygen here, right? And the way we get that molecule of oxygen there is by having this heme group that'll allow the oxygen to come into the system. And so ultimately this thing gets split into two atoms. One of them gets put into the drug, and the other gets put into water. And what's kind of cool about the active site of this enzyme is that it's very permissive, right? It's very permissive. And what I mean by that is that it can have lots of potential substrates, which is different than a typical enzyme, right? A typical enzyme, the key, I don't even know how to draw a key, so I'm not going to draw the key. But the key has to fit snugly into the active site, right? But in cytochrome P450s, there's a permissiveness of this active site. There's sometimes called a promiscuous enzyme because it can have lots of potential substrates. And so if you look at the end of the slide set, and I'm not going to go there since I'm filming this or recording this, I should say. But if you look at your last two slides, right, you look at any of those P450s that are listed, look at all of the substrates, right? You have steroids on there. You have, I don't know, I'd have to look at them, but tricyclic antidepressants, let's just compare them. They're very different looking. They don't look the same. But yet, a P450 can metabolize each, right? There's a permissiveness of this active site. And so you might have one drug that's metabolized by many different P450s. Right? A drug might be metabolized by 1A2, by 2B1, by 2C9, for example. It's possible. Right? So one of the things to think about in biotransformation is, which of the P450s is playing a role? Which is the major P450? You look at the package insert, it's going to tell you. And so watch what I do now. Put stars by some of these. 2C9, 2C19, 2D6, 3A4. The stars mean genetic polymorphism. Genetic polymorphism. And so, these different family members, which happen to be in human, right? Yeah, you might have like a 2B7 in like a mushroom, right, in a different species. But these different ones are the ones we find in human. And there are several of them which are genetically polymorphic. Now, poly means many, and morph means form. Many forms. So, each of these enzymes is coded for by a gene. Yes? DNA goes to mRNA, goes to protein. So inside your liver cells, you have genes that code for 1A2, for 2C9, for 3A4, for 2E1. You have separate genes that code for all of these separate enzymes. Yes? Now, when it comes to genetics and liver cells, we're talking about autosomal cells that have two copies of each gene. Right? We're not talking about gametes. Autosomal cells have two copies of each gene. So you inherit the gene for 1A2 from mom, and you inherit a copy of 1A2 gene from dad. You inherit a copy of 2C9 from mom, you inherit a copy from dad. The ones that have stars mean that there's more than one possibility to give you that gene. And so the best example I'll give you before I even start this is hemoglobin. Right? We talked about hemoglobin in biochem, right, earlier in the curriculum, right? And hemoglobin carries oxygen, and that's all true. But have you ever heard of sickle cell anemia? Right? What's the problem with sickle cell anemia? Which molecule is messed up? Well, that's a cell, but what molecule's messed up? Hemoglobin, right? Hemoglobin's messed up. It's not able to clump and unclump correctly, to polymerize and depolymerize correctly. And so what happens is the hemoglobin clumps, but it can't unclump, so the cells get deformed. Right? They can't spring back. They kind of get these sickle shapes, and they get stuck in the blood. And if you look at the hemoglobin between somebody with sickle cell and somebody with normal hemoglobin, there's only a single nucleotide difference. One nucleotide, that's it. So I don't know how many nucleotides are in the gene, I don't remember, but let's say it's 1,100. There's 1,100 nucleotides, let's say. And in the sickle cell patient, 10,099 nucleotides are the same. Isn't that like 99.9% the same? Right? But the effect is deleterious. Right? The effect is in a nucleotide that's needed for function. And so instead of having a certain amino acid, you get a different amino acid. I can't remember the change, but it goes from being charged to being neutral. So everything gets messed up. Well, that's a single nucleotide polymorphism. One nucleotide. 10,099 were the same. There was a mistake somewhere in copying the DNA template. And so, you remember what molecule copies DNA? It rides down the template, and it's a polymerase, and it's called DNA polymerase, right? Is DNA polymerase like perfect? Never makes any mistakes ever? No. Pretty good. It's pretty darn close to perfect. But it's not perfect. And so somewhere back in back in your lineage, back in your line, there may have been a copy made where one nucleotide is different than it should be. And that's called a single nucleotide polymorphism. What that tells you is that for the gene, there can be many forms in the human population. Right? So dad's form might be exactly normal, wild type, found in 99% of the population. Mom's form might be that polymorphism that's found in 0.2% of the population. So if you inherit a good copy from dad and a good copy from mom, you're what we call a normal metabolizer or a rapid metabolizer. If you inherit a good copy from dad and a bad copy from mom, you still have enough to compensate for the deficiency. And so you're probably still a rapid metabolizer. But if you inherit a bad copy from dad and a bad copy from mom, you're not able to metabolize that well. And so people will call you a poor metabolizer or a slow metabolizer. Now, does that make sense? So here's the problem. Like, if you're a slow metabolizer, is that something you say to your patient? You're a slow metabolizer. How's your patient going to respond? Like, what do you mean I'm slow? What's wrong with you? You have a mutation. What do you mean I have a mutation? The word mutation just means change. It doesn't necessarily say it's good or bad. Right? So change. So if you have a nucleotide change that's not in an important area of the gene and has no effect on function, we would call that another form of the gene, but it's a benign form. Would you agree? It's benign. There's no change. But if you have a change in an important part, maybe it's in the active site of the enzyme, and now the active site can't grab onto the drug too well, so that its efficiency as an enzyme is not that good. All of a sudden, it goes from being normal to being slow in terms of its catalytic activity. Are you guys following this? All right, so guys in the back who are talking, tell me what a poor metabolizer is. Why are the enzymes slow? All right, and what kind of copies do they have? They have Good copy, good copy, good copy, bad copy, bad copy, bad copy. Give me 4 metabolism. Wrong. Why? Because you have dominant recessive genes. Right? So good copy wins. So tell me what makes me a poor metabolite. Bad copy, bad copy. Now, bad copy means I can still metabolize, which is not that good. It's not as quickly as I otherwise could have. So, what do you think? Is inheriting bad copy a very common event? No. Right? Why? Because most people out there in the population are full wild type and have the functional copy. Right? So the odds of your dad and your mom having bad copy are very low. Right? But they're not no. They're just low. Right? But you have to understand, there are implications in this world of pharmacogenetics. So right now what I'm talking about is genetics. When an insurance company finds out that you're a poor metabolizer of a drug that you need to take care of you, what do you think they're going to do to your premium? They're going to raise it. Is that fair? Is it your fault? No. So a lot of people in the public, they don't understand these words. They hear mutation, they get freaked out. They don't want their medical history being broadcast. I don't want anybody to know I'm a poor metabolizer, because that can affect my insurance or whatever. That can make somebody think badly of it. Right? But in science, we're just trying to talk about the reality. You have a functional enzyme or you have an enzyme that's not functioning correctly. So the problem is, let's say that you have a poor metabolizer phenotype of 2C9. And 2C9 is needed to activate the prodrug clopidogrel. Your grandmother just had a stent put in. And you want her to live so she can come to your wedding. Right? And she just had a stent put in, and the doctor has her on Plavix. But you find out she's a poor metabolizer of 2C9 substrate. Is the Plavix going to be activated? Is the prodrug going to become the drug in her? No. So the stent is going to get blocked. And she might have a heart attack, or she might have another stent. So this conversation we're having about wild type versus polymorphism means that there's more than one copy of a gene out there in humanity. Right? And so you'll see later in chapter 5, in certain ethnic groups, there's a higher incidence of polymorphism for a particular P450 than in other ethnic groups. It's not that we're trying to focus on ethnic groups. It's just that, we were able to, over the years, see certain effects in certain ethnic groups and correlate them with the kinetics of drug action and kind of backtrack. The very first example of a genetic polymorphism was on this enzyme, 2D6. It was 1972. There was a clinical trial being done in England, and a bunch of otherwise healthy volunteers signed up for the drug to be tested phase 1. One of the guys who took the drug fainted and almost died. Had a horrible reaction to the drug. The reason why was because he was a poor metabolizer. He had a poor metabolizer phenotype of the 2D6. And the drug in his body accumulated to 100 times higher than the drug in anybody else's body. And that was never known before. That was like, well, why is this guy so weird and out there? Right? So they measured the blood metabolites, and the levels were super screaming high, and they were able to piece it together and come up with this idea of poor metabolizer versus normal. The problem is, normal is a weird word to use because you're normal and I'm not. That probably is true, but let's not go there, right? But rapid metabolizers is considered wild type. So when you start to see these phrases in the textbook or in future classes, like in my mind, chapter 5 is the most exciting chapter in the whole book because it's the future. One day, maybe in your lifetime, a person is going to go into the pharmacy and do a finger prick, and you're going to know their whole drug metabolizing phenotype. You're going to know what they're rapid at metabolizing and which enzymes are poor. So instead of picking a drug that might accumulate toxic levels because you're a poor metabolizer of a phase 2 enzyme like N-acetyltransferase, they'll pick a different drug that bypasses that one. That's better for you. That's called personalized medicine. Right now, medicine is really not personalized. Right? So Merck makes a dose. They want it to get to 1 billion people. And it's a mass approach. I want to get as much coverage as possible because it keeps my costs down and it increases my profit. And I'm not criticizing. That's the approach. Personalized medicine is expensive. I got to do blood tests on you. I got to genotype you. I got to spend a lot of people hours on you to figure out how to treat you best. But, they're going to find a way to make personalized medicine marketable and economical, and then it's going to take off. It's already being done in certain chemotherapy places, like Fox Chase Cancer Center. God forbid you come down with cancer, or your patient comes down with cancer, and they go there, they genotype them for all their drug metabolizing enzymes. So they know which drugs to avoid. Because if you take an alkylating chemotherapeutic drug that covalently binds to DNA, and that drug is poorly metabolized in that patient, the drug accumulates to high levels, and where does it go? It goes into the bone marrow, and it kills the bone marrow cell. And so the cancer patient becomes anemic, become at risk for infection, and their prognosis is horrible. But if you know they're poor metabolizer for that drug, pick a different drug. It's not going to cause bone marrow suppression in that. So they're probably not going to get an infection and die. Right? So the potential is out there. And so this idea of pharmacogenetics refers to the genetics of a single metabolizing enzyme. Right? So when I tell you 2C9 polymorphism, I'm talking pharmacogenetics. Pharmacogenomics is all of these together, like the whole profile. Right? So pharmacogenetics is a single gene and what the effect of a mutation has done on the single gene. Pharmacogenomics is like the whole panel of genes. And so here I've listed for you some phase 1 metabolizing enzymes that are polymorphic. And there are some phase 2 metabolizing enzymes that are polymorphic as well. And so for the point of education, because some of you might go and work in media, might do science writing, some of you might write package inserts, it's a lucrative career, some of you might go to the FDA, some of you might go to the Public Health Service, right? Some of you are going to communicate the language of drugs to people. It's important to have people realize mutation is not a bad word. It just means change, right? So you can think of a mutation, I have a green Maserati or I have a red Maserati. I'm still doing good. I got a Maserati. I don't care if it's green or red. It's going to get me around. It's going to work. I put gas in, it's going to drive. But if you offer me a green Maserati and a red Maserati without an engine because it can't function, well, I don't want the red Maserati because it can't function. So that's what I'm trying to get across here with this pharmacogenetics versus pharmacogenomics. So probably by the time we end today, we'll be somewhere still in genetics. And the first half of next class, we'll start with the genomics part. But when you look at chapter 4 and 5, it's like really exciting because this information is like 2-3 years old. Right, so we're right there. And just FYI, there's like an accreditation body called the American Council for Pharmaceutical Education, and they, they're putting this into all of their standards for pharmacy colleges. They want students to have an understanding of pharmacogenomics and what it might mean for individualized, personalized therapies as we move forward. Okay, everybody. So I'm going to start again, and basically here, the first part is kind of review, right? We've talked about phase 1 metabolism. We've talked about the fact that you've taken the drug and made it slightly more polar. And so usually phase 1 metabolism results in exposure of a functional group that has an ability to hydrogen bond. Right? So if you look at these functional groups, hydroxy, aminos, sulfhydryls are all what we would call hydrogen bond donors. Hydrogen bond donors have a higher energy of interaction with water than even a hydrogen bond acceptor. So if you had to pick, you'd pick to be a hydrogen bond donor if you wanted to be more hydrogen. Right? And so exposure of these functional groups is the net outcome of phase 1. But by far, most of the phase 1 metabolic reactions are oxidation reactions. Okay, and so if we look what happens following exposure of that functional group, then we have conjugation with endogenous molecules. Endogenous molecules mean molecules that's already in there. Right? Molecules that's already in the cell. It's endogenous to the cell. It's part of the cell. It's floating around inside the cell. And so what are some of the endogenous molecules? Glucuronic acid, sulfate, glutathione, right, and some other certain amino acids which are polar, like glycine. Even acetates are useful in phase 2 metabolism. And so in this slide, the left portion talks about the name of the conjugate. Conjugate is a word that means physical joining. Right? Conjugation means physical joining of an endogenous reactant with the phase 1 metabolite. Physical covalent link. The problem is that these conjugation reactions cannot spontaneously happen. Right? They need an enzyme. The enzyme can lower the activation energy and allow the reactions to happen. The enzymes all have these similar root names. So if you look, ACE, enzyme, transferase is an enzyme that transfers something. So they all are transferases. What are they transferring? Are they transferring glucuronic acid? Are they transferring sulfate? Are they transferring glutathione? Are they transferring an acetate group? Right, so what I like students to know is the name of the product form, the name of the enzyme, and the source of this endogenous reactant. Right, so for example, a phase 2 metabolic enzyme that transfers glucuronic acid is called UDP, glucuronyl transferase. And so if you were to look at the most commonly encountered phase 2 enzymes, they all are moving something from an endogenous reactant to the substrate. The substrate is the phase 1 metabolite. Now, phase 2 conjugates, before I kind of show you some pictures, are highly polar. They're easy to excrete, and they tend to be inactive, although you see I put a star here because there's at least one example for that rule. In the case of morphine glucuronide, and morphine is an opioid drug, morphine glucuronide is more potent as an analgesic than morphine itself, which is weird because it's a glucuronate. It should be highly water soluble. And so if you look through literature and try to understand why that may be, we don't exactly know, but there's one set of data that suggests that the glucuronide is facing away from the surface of the molecule, so that the molecule is still mostly hydrophobic. Whether that's correct or not, I can't really say. I haven't researched it enough. But this is an example of a phase 2 conjugate that's more active than the parent drug, which kind of goes against the tide in terms of what we usually think of these things as doing. Now, this concept of enterohepatic recirculation is worth mentioning in passing. This is going to apply to drugs which are generally high molecular weight conjugates that have been excreted into the bile. And the bile flows into which organ? Flows into the large intestine, feces, right? And so the bile is going to get there, right? And when it gets there, it's going to contain the drug that's been dumped into it. But the lumen of the intestine is lined by bacteria. It's called the intestinal flora. Right? So the lining of the intestine is filled with bacteria. So the bacteria are not just like neutral things that do nothing. In some cases, the bacteria can cleave the conjugate. Right? So if this is the phase 1 reaction, this is the phase 2 conjugate, this has been dumped into the bile, and now the microflora cleave the conjugate, this is absorbable again. Yes? It's much less polar because the conjugate is being off. So here, the parent drug can be released back into the systemic circulation. You thought it was being excreted and being dumped in the feces. And here it is coming back, being reabsorbed. So this word enterohepatic is telling you what's happening. The drug is cycling back from the bile, right? It's being dumped by the liver into the bile, ending up in the gut, but the gut is cleaving it. So it's being reabsorbed systemically, coming back to the liver. The liver is changing it, dumping it in the bile. The microflora is cleaving off that conjugate, came back into systemic circulation, go back into the liver. So there's a cycle that forms between the liver and the gut. That's called enterohepatic recirculation. And so in this process, the drug, it looks like it's going to be eliminated. It looks like it's almost out the door, but the microflora cleaves the conjugate, the drug gets reabsorbed. This occurs in morphine. This occurs in tetracycline. This occurs in certain estrogens. And so if you were to look at oral contraceptives have an estrogen component. The estrogen gets conjugated and dumped into the bile, but the microflora cleaves some of that, and so some of the estrogen gets reabsorbed. Right? So the dose that's put into the oral contraceptive takes account of the enterohepatic recirculation. Let's imagine a scenario now where a woman's taking hormonal contraceptive and she has an infection. The doctor puts her on an antibiotic. And the antibiotic wipes out the bad bacteria, but wipes out her gut microflora. What's going to happen if the gut microflora gets wiped out? Is the conjugated drug going to be reabsorbed, or is it going to be dumped? So if it's dumped, what's going to happen to the blood levels of the hormonal contraceptive? Will fall. But the blood levels have to be here to protect against pregnancy, but they just fell. So what might happen? Pregnancy. Right? So some antibiotics are known for that. High is a relative term. Okay, so I would say, generally by high, anywhere 350 up. Right, so that includes a lot of drugs. But generally, smaller drugs, generally smaller drugs are going to end up in here. Right, so, I mean, high is debatable, and where you slide the rule, we can argue about. But generally speaking, higher weight drugs end up in the body. And this isn't always an issue, but it was an issue in the 70s when women were taking rifampin for tuberculosis infection. They were getting pregnant. People were trying to figure out what happened. And so we'll talk again about this in a later class on endocrine, because not all antibiotics are as guilty as others of doing this. But this is actually another reason why when people take antibiotics, sometimes they get upset stomach, sometimes they get diarrhea, right? Sometimes their gut doesn't feel good because the fact that the drug may also be killing the good bacteria that line the gut. Does that make sense, this process? Now, there's a normal substrate that does this, right? The bile salts. The bile salts are reabsorbed through enterohepatic cycling. And if you were to ever look at the structure of the bile salts, they're derived from cholesterol. So there are some cholesterol-lowering drugs that actually work by shutting down the reabsorption of bile salts through this pathway, and the cholesterol gets dumped. So in cardiorenal, you'll learn about those drugs. Okay, so principal metabolic organ is the liver, with some other organs possessing some metabolic capacity. Even the brain can metabolize some drugs. Okay, first pass effects we've already talked about, but many ways to get a first pass effect. I'll just go to the stat, which is I think on the next slide, just some examples. So all of these are possible ways to get a first pass effect. The intestinal flora might metabolize the drug before it can get systemic. The drug might be unstable in the acid environment of the stomach, like penicillin. Right? Penicillin is very acid sensitive. You can give it by mouth, But look at the dose you're going to give. Right? 1,000 milligrams, 1,200 milligrams, 1,500 milligrams. Right? So most of what's coming out is much less than that. Right? That which survived the acidic environment. Insulin can be cleaved by digestive enzymes before it could ever get absorbed. And last but not least, there are enzymes in the intestinal wall. And so this is why catecholamines are unable to be given orally. Right? Why can't you give dopamine by mouth to somebody with Parkinson's disease? There's two reasons. First is it wouldn't get absorbed because the intestinal wall degrades. There's an enzyme in intestinal epithelial cells called monoamine oxidase. Monoamine oxidase cleaves catecholamines. So it can't get absorbed. But even if it did, it can't cross the blood-brain barrier. Right? Now, you can give dopamine in certain situations intravenously for certain diseases, and we will discuss that in the later chapters, right? But not for Parkinson's disease. So you can circumvent this by another route, but you can't replace the dopamine that's degraded due to Parkinson's disease. And so people use prodrugs that get converted to dopamine in that situation that do access the brain. Okay, so this figure is really old, but it kind of basically outlines everything in terms of these metabolic changes. So drug over here usually goes through phase 1, which makes it slightly more polar, goes through phase 2 and makes it excretable. There are some drugs which can directly enter, as this line is telling you, phase 2. Right, so you administer the drug and it just doesn't go through phase 1. It just immediately gets metabolized by phase 2. One example of a drug that does that is isoniazid. And we abbreviate that INH. Isoniazid. And INH is the international abbreviation for that drug. That's a drug that first goes into phase 2 and then goes into phase 1. So it's kind of a weird exception, right? And that drug has been used in millions of people to treat tuberculosis, right? So if you think back 100 years backwards from now, right? It's 1915. All throughout the U.S., there were these places called sanatoriums where you put TB patients because there was no antibiotics. So you put them in the sanatorium, which were just like big rooms with lots of beds. Try to keep the environment, sanitized, sterile to the point you can. And people either survived or they didn't. So something like 30% of the population was infected, and something like 50% of those people would succumb to it. It was called consumption. It was a bad thing to have, right? And so along came streptomycin, along came isoniazid, and we wiped out TB in the U.S. But there's still a lot of TB in the world. Something like 2 billion infected people. Billion. Not all of them with active disease, but still a big burden on the human population. And so isoniazid is an interesting drug because it can go through phase 2 metabolism. It gets acetylated by N-acetyltransferase. And it would get acetylated again and eliminated. But in a poor metabolizer, what happens is they're not that good at acetylating. So they acetylate the first time, but the second time hardly ever happens. And along comes Rob Kardashian, 2E1, metabolizes it into a highly reactive electrophile that can bind to proteins and DNA in the liver and cause fulminant, life-threatening liver toxicity. Right? So isoniazid, it's a low incidence of fulminant hepatotoxicity associated with it. But when you're putting it in 1 million people or 10 million people, you're going to see some cases of this hepatotoxicity linked to poor metabolizer phenotype. Right, so I like this figure for that reason. It shows you the middle portion is what usually happens. There's some exceptions. And then there's some drugs that draw a line from drug to out, like lithium or metformin. Don't get metabolized at all. So I know you've had med chem, and I'm not here to really reteach you med chem. Do I have my pointer? Yeah. So, do I? I don't know. Is it there? It's not there. I don't know. There we go. Now, I'm not that particularly good at identifying compounds, so I couldn't necessarily tell you that this was an azo reduction unless I read it over here. But the consequence of the azo reduction is the freeing up of amino groups. So here we had a situation where we had hydrogen bond acceptors. Here we have a situation where we've got 4 hydrogens that can act as hydrogen bond donors. Much more polar than here. Right? If you were to look at the next page, I wouldn't necessarily know to call this a olefinic hydroxylation. But here's the before picture, here's the after picture. Here I got 2 polar groups exposed that can hydrogen bond with water. Right? So I'm much more polar than I was before. Benzylic hydroxylation. Alright? Okay. But here's the hydroxy group, but much more polar in the after picture than before. These are typical phase 1 reactions that get carried out by the P450s. And so not to belabor the point, I have been known in the past to show a reaction and ask you if it's phase 1 or phase 2 or phase 3 or phase 4. Okay. So let's talk a little bit now about the actual reaction, the mixed function oxidase. The mixed function oxidase does this. Takes the oxygen molecule, breaks it into 2, puts 1 in the drug, puts 1 into water. But the mixed function oxidase needs a coenzyme helper. Right? So the CYP450 does the oxidation, but it needs an assister or a helping molecule, helping enzyme. When an enzyme helps another enzyme, it's called a coenzyme. This coenzyme, NADPH cytochrome P450 reductase, is going to donate electrons to this enzyme. NADPH is a 1 or 2 electron donor. Remember from biochem? 2 electron donor. Right? FADH2, 1 electron donor. FMN, 1 electron donor. Here, 2 electron donor. Now, we say 2 important microsomal enzymes. Which organelle is the microsome?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, in the
ER, but the smooth. But very good. Microsome is a small soma body, small fragment of the ER. Why not just the ER? Well, it has technical answer. When you isolate organelles out of cells, you spin them down with varying g-forces. Right? So to get mitochondria, you might spin cells down at 100,000 g, right? 100,000 times the force of gravity. And yet, amazingly, this mitochondria has survived the super duper tremendous g-force. So for that itself, I give it respect. I respect you. Right? The endoplasmic reticulum can't handle it. So it fragments into little pieces when you spin it down. It's the most fragile organelle. You can't isolate an intact ER. It just doesn't work. It just breaks into pieces. So imagine having a nice bowl on the table and it just falls on the ground. It shatters into little pieces. Those little pieces are called microsomes. But within that membranous little piece, there's an enzyme called P450. So that's why we say microsome. So microsomal enzyme is an enzyme in the smooth ER. So we got CYP450 and the NADPH CYP450. And so, how does it all work? Well, if we start with our drug way up there, and we don't look at anything else, and we look at our drug over here, we see that it's been hydroxylated. Right? So it has come out of the enzyme active site as oxidized. Right? So this enzyme active site has our drug, has oxygen, right? And the drug comes out oxidized, and that other oxygen atom gets put into water. So if you look around the circle, we have oxygen coming in to the active site. But the oxygen only comes into the active site when the iron is +2. Right? So if you look around this circle up there, you see the iron is +3. But only iron +2 can attach to the oxygen, just like hemoglobin, by the way. Hemoglobin has iron +2 that carries around the oxygen molecule. Right? So iron +3 is called ferric iron. Ick. I don't want to touch you, oxygen. Right? But iron +2 is ferrous, the two of us, iron. Right? Iron +2 picks up the oxygen. The oxygen comes into the enzyme active site. Now, how do you go from a +3 to a +2? What particle must you acquire? An electron. Where does the electron come from in this model? NADPH, cytochrome P450 reductase. So the first electron comes in, brings it to Fe+2. Then the oxygen can come up to this heme cofactor. Right? So now you've got the drug in the active site, the oxygen in the active site, but we've only transferred one electron, and we have to transfer 2. Second electron comes in, and now makes a very unstable negatively charged oxygen molecule, which falls apart. One of the atoms gets reduced to water, the other atom is put into the substrate. Mixed function oxidase. The O2 got split, one got reduced to water, one got put into the drug. All P450s do this. They all do this catalytic cycle. So this is what we call the P450 cycle. And what I've done in the next 7 slides is I've labeled the steps that I've just explained and given you the words to the steps as well. I've given some energetics and such, but basically this is the reaction. And here with you, student, as a student at Rutgers, my professor was Dr. Alan Connie. Dr. Alan Connie used to be the head of drug research at Hoffman LaRoche. But before that, he was a student in the lab of the Millers, a husband-wife team at the University of Wisconsin. I feel bad for Wisconsin. But, so Dr. Connie worked with the Millers, and he's actually the person who have discovered the cytochrome P450. So I studied under a professor, lectured, the professor who discovered the P450. And he's an interesting character. He has passed away. He passed away about 3 years ago. He was 87, and he worked until the day he died. When he got the pink slip from Hoffman LaRoche, when they decided to change their research plan and their research focus, Hoffman LaRoche was, the U.S. portion was based in Nutley, New Jersey. Do you know where the Meadowlands is? Nutley, New Jersey is on the other side. And Hoffman LaRoche just officially closed. So they took their 3,000 jobs and moved to California. A lot of PhDs without working, you know. But when he lost his job, he took his whole team with him to Rutgers, and they opened up a department. And they basically opened up the Department of Pharmaceutical Science. And they started teaching people like me about this. So I'm now teaching you. So you can trace yourself back to Dr. Connie. You can trace yourself back to the Millers who discovered something. That's pretty cool. Now, okay. So follow me here. Here's our conjugation reactions. And I can't see my pointer. So X, there's the X. The X is the exposed functional group. And here's our glucuronidation reaction. So follow the X, follow the X, follow the X. RX, sugar. That molecule is way hydrophilic. Right? Do you agree? When it went from RX to RX glucuronide, did it change? Did it become really water soluble? Right? And the same can be true, same can be said of all of these reactions, right? If we look over here at RX, hey, that's like pharmacy, RX. I didn't even know that. All these years. All right, so RX sulfate, boom, right? sulfate got a lot of ionizable side groups there, much more water soluble than it was before. Where does it grab the sulfate? It grabs it off of this structure. This structure is called phosphoadenosyl phosphosulfate. Phosphoadenosyl phosphosulfate, PAPS. So one of my classmates in homeroom, senior year, her name was Lisa Papagala. Everybody called her Paps. Hey, Paps. And so now I think of her whenever I talk to my students about Paps. I mean, she was nice. We didn't know each other that well, but everybody called her Paps. Phosphoadenosyl phosphosulfate. So you pull that sulfate off there, put it onto the glucose function. Let's look at this thing. Gamma glutamyl, here's a glycine, and here's an amino acid in the middle. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. This one structure is drawn for you. This is just the word, and this is just the word. Glutamyl, blankamyl, glycine. What's this amino acid? Free sulfhydryl. Bring it on, man. Free sulfhydryl. Come on, I ask this in biochem like all the time. It's the only one with a free sulfhydryl, the only amino acid. Cysteine. Very good. Whoever said that. Very good. Right? So here's a sulfhydryl. Glutathione is a tripeptide. Glutamyl, cysteine, glycine. You ever see it sold in the nutraceutical portion of the store? Guess what? It's not absorbable, man. You can take as much as you want. It ain't going to get in your body. Right? Glutathione is not absorbable. It has to be made inside the cell, or a precursor called cysteine. So the cell makes it from cysteine. It takes cysteine, puts the glutamate on one side, puts the glycine on the other. There's the tripeptide. What can you tell me about glutamate and glycine? Are they polar amino acids or non-polar amino acids? Polar, right? Because they interact with water, and so if they were hydrophobic, we wouldn't be talking about them. So here's our disposed functional group. Follow it. R, S, glutathione. So the enzyme that does this reaction is called glutathione S transferase. GST. Glutathione S transferase. Sometimes you see glutathione abbreviated as GSH. The G stands for glutathione. The SH is the sulfhydryl group on cysteine. Okay, so glutathione S transferase transfers glutathione to the exposed functional group. It becomes more water soluble. This formation is called a mercapturate. A mercapturate is a glutathione conjugate. Sulfate is a sulfated conjugate. A glucuronate is a conjugate with glucuronic acid. Now, if you look at this slide, just ignore the last two columns, but concentrate on the first three. All right? The type of conjugation, the name of the endogenous reactant, and the enzyme and its location. Okay? So glucuronidation is carried out by UDP glucuronyl transferase. The endogenous reactant, UDP glucuronic acid, made in the cell, just there, stick around in the cell, transferred the glucuronate to the exposed functional group. And this is happening in the microsomes. Glucuronidation is carried out in the microsomal portion, just like phase 1. Does it make sense that phase 1 and phase 2 would happen close by? Yeah. But most other phase 2 reactions are happening away from the ER. Right? Most other phase 2 reactions are happening in the cytosol, or in maybe other places. Okay? If you look at sulfate conjugation, there's the official name of PAPS. Cytosol. Right? Cytosol. So for the most part, phase 2 reactions are outside or non-microsomal, with the exception of glucuronidation. And so I indicated that for you in this slide. The microsomal reaction phase 2 is glucuronidation. Okay, the non-microsomal enzymes catalyze most of the other phase 2 reactions. Now, there's one more type of inactivating enzyme that we should pause and give respect to, and that is called the non-specific esterases that are found in several places, like the liver and the GI tract, but also the plasma. These are enzymes that break ester bonds. And they're kind of interesting because they even float around in the plasma. So one of the most famous and highly prolific esters that is used by our body is called acetylcholine. It's a choline ester. We're going to learn about its synthesis and such later. But acetylcholine is a very pathetic drug. The creator made it and uses it all the time to slow down our heart or make us salivate or whatever we need to do. Right? But you can't really use it as a drug because even if you give it IV, the blood inactivates it. Because that esterase is in the blood. Right? So acetylcholine is not really used as a drug. That's why we have this whole chapter coming up on cholinomimetics, drugs that act like acetylcholine. Succinylcholine is one of those that we talked about. And while it's a longer acting analog of acetylcholine, it doesn't really last that long because of these esterases. And so acetylcholine esterase is one we'll talk about it a lot, but there's also non-specific esterases that are present in various places. So file this one away and realize that we'll get back to it when we start the autonomic nervous system. All right, so phase 2 conjugation reactions, more polar, usually excretable, no problem usually, and typically inactive. Which leads me to my last 6 minutes or so, where I kind of try to summarize this up today, talking about acetaminophen. Now, acetaminophen is it's called a antipyretic agent. What does pyresis mean? Fire! 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 Antipyresis, anti-fire, anti-fever. Right? It's a fever breaker. I did that better in the morning. I guess and it was awesome because we had a fire drill this morning. And so it like came together. Fire was the Anyway, so acetaminophen, right? So it's this drug, and do you need a prescription to get it? No. So you can go into Walgreens and buy some, and you can go into CVS and buy some, and you can go into Tom's Drugs and buy some. And either intentionally or unintentionally get overdose. What's the problem? Well, first let's talk about what normally happens. Therapeutically, 95% of acetaminophen is readily and easily detoxified through glucuronidation or through sulfation. Now, the 5% that's left actually is toxic. The 2E1 makes a toxic metabolite, about 5% of the therapeutic dose. Well, your body detoxifies it, usually no problem. So I tried to depict this for you in this kind of flow chart, where you put acetaminophen in the middle, and most of the time, phase 1 metabolism, and then phase 2 sulfation, phase 2 glucuronidation, and out. About 5% gets metabolized by the toxic P450-2E1. And 2E1 causes the acetaminophen to form a reactive structure. And that reactive compound can bind to cell macromolecules like DNA and RNA and protein and form adducts, leading to hepatotoxicity. But luckily, your body uses a backup system where it conjugates the toxic metabolite to glutathione through the action of GST, down as transferase. And so long as your cells have glutathione, the toxic metabolite is inactivated, so we capture it and it's eliminated. The problem that arises is in an overdose scenario, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So I got a presentation on Friday and I feel miserable. So I'm going to take Tylenol. I'm going to take some combo drug, cold medicine, Hapitap, Tylenol in it, or acetaminophen in it. I didn't look. And so you got a patient coming up to the counter, and she's got 4 combo products, and they all contain Tylenol, acetaminophen in that. Now she's unintentionally overdosed. Maybe didn't read the label. The problem became very rampant about 10 years ago. The FDA actually issued warnings to pharmacies and said, keep an eye on your patients in terms of the combo products they're buying, because many of these over-the-counter products contain acetaminophen. So that would be unintentional overdose. But what's the problem? Hepatotoxicity. If you even read the label, it says may be potentially hepatotoxic. Right? So hepatotoxicity. But wait, we have GST. What's the problem? The problem is GSH is finite and limited. Right? The cells only have some in reserve. The rest they make de novo from cysteine. And I told you before, you can't give somebody an IV infusion of glutathione because it doesn't get absorbed into the cells. So the hepatocytes won't suck it up. So what do you give to treat an overdose? If you can't give this, you give a prodrug called cysteine. Right? The prodrug is actually called N-acetylcysteine. And N-acetylcysteine gets taken into the cells through the cysteine transporter, cells of the liver. And the cells of the liver put a glutamate on it, put a glycine on it, and they form glutathione de novo. What do you think? You think that happens quickly, like with seconds, or you think it takes hours, or you think it takes days? Hours, right? So the patient comes in overdose, they're not going to die quickly. That's, misconception, right? If you overdose on acetaminophen, you die a slow and painful death. Your liver liquefies, right, over days. And then you realize she wasn't worth it. That nurse is taking care of me. She's beautiful. She wants me to live. She's all about me, that woman right there. But I have no liver, right? That ain't good. And so actually, if you read, in the U.S., it's something like 10,000 unintentional acetaminophen overdoses each year, and something like 5,000 intentional acetaminophen overdoses each year. And if you kind of profile these people, they tend to be young men in their mid-20s who've been in long-term relationships where the girlfriend dumps him by text message. Right? Seriously. I'm not joking. People do that these days. Remember, dignitas. A woman will respect you much, much more if you break up with her and tell her the truth than if you lie and squeeze your way out. Just tell her, I'm not in love, and you deserve to be loved. And that's it. And she's going to cry and hate you, and she'll get over it. Right? But if you text her, nah, not today, nah. Then, no. Right? And vice versa, ladies. Guys are sensitive beneath it all. So this is actually where I stopped in all my sections. So I'm very happy. Thank you for your attention. Have a nice day. I'll see you on Friday. You usually have to get this but usually take a Friday. He might read that. If we had to, I think we wanted to not. Yeah. I can't.